All right, excellent. Well, welcome to ATG the podcast. It's good to be here today with Heather Staines and Doreen Bradley to talk about the Charleston briefings that we all worked on together, that they mostly did, of course. And I, why don't we start just by having Heather and Doreen introduce themselves, and then we'll get moving.
Thanks, Matthew. I'll kick off. I'm Heather Staines, and I am a senior consultant at Delta Think, where I also manage a data and analytics tool. So I'm the director for community engagement for that. I've been in the scholarly communication space for probably longer than I'd care to admit, but let's just say at least 25 years. And during that time, I've been fortunate to work with libraries and librarians in a variety of different capacities. And I've been director for the Charleston Library Conference for quite a number of years. So very happy to be here with you today.
Mhm, mhm. And I'm Doreen Bradley, Director of Learning Programs and Initiatives at the University Library of the University of Michigan. And that's actually how Heather and I met, was at the Charleston Conference. And in my role at the university, I head up a unit of teaching librarians, about 10 of us who teach for largely undergraduates, but I also teach a credit course there. My background's actually in medical libraries, but more recently I've been involved in a number of learning analytics projects at the university, and that is how I think Heather and my work dovetailed around privacy, around patron data.
All right, excellent. I think this is a good introduction to this briefing on library privacy. The topic of library privacy is obviously a very important one. Changed a lot from when we entered this field, where we were primarily thinking, don't let anybody see our patrons' records. And that was about the end of it. It's a lot more complicated now. So, where did the idea for a book on library privacy come from?
So Heather and I have had a few different collaborations that kind of led up to the book. And as I mentioned, in 2019, Heather and I were part of a panel that was at the Charleston Conference that was on patron privacy and library privacy. And there was a lot of interest at that time as libraries, I think, had begun collecting more data. They were just storage was cheap. There were lots of ways that we could collect patron data to better understand our own services. So after that, in 2021, we edited an issue of the journal Serials Librarian that was all about privacy in libraries, and it cast a very wide net about privacy. And again, there was a lot of interest, so we decided to take it a step further and edit a book, and we invited some of our co-authors from the journal issue and then expanded from there. So kind of each project built on the previous one.
So, after these years of building up to this topic, what are some of the topics that you've covered in this briefing, and how did you come to have these particular people to write for you?
Yeah, I can jump in here. Um, So the first right of refusal we gave to authors who had participated in the Serials Librarian issue, and we had a nice interest from that group. But then we knew that we wanted to expand, beyond, just those topics. But that I think that a lot in that special issue still remains relevant for folks who want to check it out. Um, we we're really cognizant, as you said, Matthew, that some of the early privacy issues were what would seem more straightforward in those days, local issues around patron activities. But then, of course, as online interaction with resources and online teaching grew, that led to more complexity and more questions around what was being collected and how it was being stored. So we kind of jump up from those local issues to a national or global level where you have these large systems large service providers, and really trying to look in detail and contracting language and settings, what is going to be shared, and just backing up a little bit to look at what is the right to privacy and how that has played out, in a wider sphere before drilling down, just a little bit into the library context. Some of the specific topics, per the table of contents, we have quite a nice group that wrote about privacy and the gray data that libraries have collected. I think that group was spearheaded by Clark Yakovakis, and Megan Mackin, who were part of the original Serials Librarian cohort, but joined by several others. We wanted to make sure we did have practical information in the book. So Brady Lund, who came over from the special issue, talks about crafting a privacy policy that will work for your library. So many folks are, in the nuts and bolts of systems. So Emily Ray has put together a really nice step-by-step about just using Alma as an example of, what kinds of settings are available and why you might want to choose one or another. And then we had a group led by Craig Smith that really looked at taking University of Michigan libraries as an example, patrons' thoughts about library data, which is a wonderful topic to delve into that seems to be shifting all of the time. And then they were also joined by Tim Lloyd, who took a look at privacy and access control issues, and really kind of zooms out to the 30,000-foot view to talk about things that are happening there. So it's a really nice array of topics, complementary to and updating some of the things in the special issue. Yeah, I'm really excited that it's finally available.
Yeah, I was really struck when I was reading through these different articles by how, we used to, again, back to my old way of looking at this, we were basically protecting our information from other people's view because we had people's cards and we didn't want anyone else to know what was kept on those cards. Nowadays, that information is centralized. It's accessible to so many different people, given different levels of permissions, different levels all across the university of shared data. We no longer are the only ones who have data about these users and their activities, I guess. And so it becomes a much broader and more complicated issue about these systems, our participation in those systems, who we partner with, what do other people do. I mean, it's a much more complicated matter. So I guess, my question is, well, what are some of the pressing issues today in dealing with privacy? And what are the most difficult ones to solve? Because it seems like there are lots of pressing issues and they're all difficult to solve.
Yeah, and I think both Heather and I jotted some ideas down on this. I think a lot of the chapters in the book actually kind of speak to some of these issues, such as library contracts with third-party vendors. Looking at a university standpoint, how much patron data do we send over to these third-party vendors so they know who our users are? They, of course, typically want more than what we will send. And we try and send the bare minimum, but then to use some features in the products, you have to set up an account and they require patrons to actually give more information about themselves than our university typically sends for authentication. So there's some tension there that our vendors actually have more data on our patrons than we do about what they use. So, and we don't necessarily have access to that, all of that data either. So the whole issue of authentication and seamless users wanting to authenticate just once to get to any library resource. So what information is passed on to other vendors or other services that we actually don't see on the library end and don't know that they're using either or have much control over. Um, and I think Tim Lloyd, his part talks to a lot of this. And then Craig Smith in the study that he did actually with two of our undergraduate students, and they talked to a good number of students, did interviews, did surveys to find out what students actually thought of the data that we collect. And by and large, the students do trust the library and librarians with their data. They just want to know what's actually being collected and what we're using it for. They're typically okay with us using it, like we want to improve services, right? We're not using it for anything that gets too heavily into their coursework or things like that. We just want to improve services. And by and large, they're okay with that. But they do want opportunities to opt in and opt out. And that can be a challenging thing to implement as well on the library end of things. Um, so,
Yeah, from my side, I think one of the most difficult issues is actually not necessarily a library or a publisher issue. It's some of the larger changes that the major browser creators are putting in place, the Chrome, the Firefox, the Safari, and that is with the best of intentions to be privacy preserving. But just as one example, um, Google is rolling out to Chrome users uh, this IP address obfuscation so that when you're using resources, they will not know your IP address, which of course is a primary underpinning for how access to resources, has been provided, in the academic content space. So I do work for the STM Association's Seamless Access group, and they've been keeping quite a close eye on these browser changes. I've noticed more recently at library conferences, NASIG, for example, there have been presentations about how these upcoming changes are potentially probably going to break access. And we are hearing from libraries that this may be happening already. So when you're trying to troubleshoot an access issue, with a patron, make sure that you do consider that it could be actually a feature of the browser that they're in and not a bug in your system. So I think that's going to be a high priority issue to solve, and we might see more places actually switching to federated authentication as to not be so dependent on IP authentication. Because I think we all support privacy, but we know that that the users get very frustrated if they're impeded from getting to their content that they need.
Yeah, and there's so many different players in the system who want the information about the users for different purposes, not necessarily exploitative purposes. So if we need to be able to IP authenticate and Google is making it hard for us to do that, then we're going to have to figure out another way. And I don't know, do you think there's a a reasonable expectation that libraries will be able to respond to that change?
I know that they're preparing and that they're aware that it's coming. I see that in interaction, with the Seamless Access team, for example. And I think the browser companies are starting to listen as they get a little bit further in their plans. They don't want to break things for libraries. Um, so they're for a while, I think we might be able to get by with some opt-in settings. So it would become like an educational part of what the library, is already doing, as well as I mentioned that troubleshooting part. I mean, such smart, resourceful people. I'm sure we will figure it out and create guides. And so there are more and more universities that are moving, towards a federated authentication environment, because it's not just library resources. It might be your employee benefits, your healthcare benefits, other types of resources that need to be accessed more securely. So putting the library resources in that sort of same category is another path forward, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but why don't we move on to some other thoughts that you might have about this topic? Heather, what else do you see as being an important matter to address here?
Yeah, I think the perception and awareness of the different privacy provisions within technology is a good one, to delve into. As Doreen said, the students, for example, are not um, necessarily opposed to having their data used to improve their experience, but they just want the opportunity to have details about that. So in my work on seamless access and also on GetFTR, which is designed to work with upstream discovery services and let folks that know that they have access to content that's open access, free, and subscribed. It's just to make sure that the GDPR compliant aspects of collaboration initiatives like that are front and center. Keep raising awareness for libraries that are interested in looking into the privacy aspects of all of the resources that they're using. Seamless Access has been promoting for a little bit more than, I think, a year now, something called the Seamless Access Toolkit. This was not available when Tim Lloyd wrote his chapter, but there's a lot of information online, lots of presentations, ERNL, Charleston, and NASIG, where there's some checklists and resources that libraries can take a look at, maybe at renewal time, maybe if they're considering a new resource that asks questions about both internal questions: what is the library collecting, and how is that either stored, how is it transferred, how can it be removed at a patron's request, but then also the companies that libraries work with and the companies that those companies work with, and what's happening in that kind of larger data sphere. So I think there's a lot of information out there if you're looking for it, and you can always contact me too, and I'm happy to point you.
Doreen, how about you? What do you have some thoughts about this and what the most important matters for you are?
Yeah, coming from higher education, just education in general, there's a couple other things that affect data collection and use for us. In the US, we have the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which everybody calls FERPA. So FERPA is really designed to protect student data and who has access to that student data. It doesn't do a lot for what data you collect or where you store it, but it's who has access to it. So for us, any data that we collect, we typically have to go through an IRB process to gain access to that data. And so we have a lot of measures and checks and balances as to who has access, obviously, and how we use that data and how we engage with users and letting them know that we're using their data. But it is fairly limited in scope. The GDPR, on the other hand, in the EU applies much more broadly to data collected by all types of institutions, libraries included. So it does affect our usage of our resources by any of our patrons who may be in Europe at the time. So in some places we have both FERPA and GDPR that we have to work with. So the GDPR is much more, I don't want to say necessarily restrictive, but there's a lot more checks and balances, and it really encourages institutions to be a lot more transparent with their users about what data they collect and how they're using it. And there's a lot more consent involved than there is with FERPA. So actually kind of think this is a good thing, and along the lines of how thought is changing just in general about patron data. It used to be that we really thought, oh, we have the ability to collect it, we should collect it. There may be some study down the road that we can do with it, but now we really think about what data we're collecting. Maybe we just need to do it for a more limited time, and it's not something we do in perpetuity, and that we really see it as a partnership opportunity with patrons, to educate them about their own rights with privacy and what they should be thinking about even once they leave our institutions. And so there's a whole education process in it, and it really invites, I think, a partnership between users and libraries, that is good for both parties.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the question of consent is not what we were worried about before, but
Right.
because of the way these systems operate and the interoperability with different entities, publishers, vendors of all sorts, Google, the library, the registrar, the question of consent is quite important. I wonder if you could just give us a quick overview of your view, either one of you or both, about consent and where does that start to become an issue? And what is your view of this?
I can jump in just a little bit. I
Yep.
think, when GDPR was rolled out, as Doreen mentioned so broadly, a number of years ago, we started to see those pop-ups on websites, the banners and the like, where we were asked to, either accept all or accept necessary cookies, those kinds of things. And I fear that that's largely invisible to us now. Like we click to make it go away. And I know that I've recently started thinking as I'm collecting accept all, and I do wide-ranging research. So I'm looking at websites that really don't have a lot necessarily to do with my own, personal interests. That maybe I need to take a breath and, think about whether I just want to automatically accept all. So I think we want to make sure that consent isn't lost in this like wider sea of things that we're asking people to do. If they're going to have to do so much clicking before they can get access to a resource, maybe they're going to go the path of, uh, let's say, research misconduct, a kind of a piracy website or something, which isn't going to give them that many pop-ups. So I think we need to balance the user experience and try to make sure that the collection of that consent, happens at a point where they can give a thoughtful response, and they're not, just kind of clicking, to make things go away because we want to make sure that that consent, stays meaningful, in front of mind. And there are, some other large, European initiatives coming out. There's one coming out around accessibility and things. So, as publishers and content providers are revisiting how their site is set up, I hope that they might look at how those little click boxes work to make sure they're still doing what we want them to do, which is to preserve privacy.
Yeah, and building on some things Heather said, the difference between consent and being informed that your data is being collected, and when do we do which of those? We obviously need some data for our business purposes and to make our systems run, and things that we absolutely know that we want to collect so that we can have enough data to do some analysis on services. But then looking largely at what data can we do an opt-in, opt-out, or at least get some consent from students, and then let them know that for the other systems where we do collect their data, exactly how we use it, even if we're not asking them for their consent to collect it. And even that, I think, goes a long way in them being more okay with us collecting the data if they know what we're using it for. If we can share some sort of cycle about when we would get rid of their data, so we don't keep it, for forever, but maybe we keep it for 5 or 10 years and whatever we need to do for our business purposes. So, and even at our our university, we are trying to do that with more of our systems because, as you noted, you mentioned registrar data, Matthew, and because there is so much data that we collect, it's when you combine that with registrar data, we can know a lot about our students, and not that we necessarily should, but you can get pretty granular with what you're looking for about behaviors and activities and engagement with library resources and other things on campus. So our university's really tried to come up with something, we call it VisiBlue, so that we tell students exactly what data we collect about them, how long we keep it, what we do with it, to try and be as transparent as possible and respectful to their data. But so that distinction between, I think, just informing them we are collecting this versus where we can actually give them some choice about whether we collect or not. And we actually have changed our policy about that back in 2016. We changed our privacy policy in the library where we just started keeping circulation data in perpetuity on anything that people checked out, and which was great for us. We had a lot of data. We could see what parts of campus were using which types of resources. That helped us financially to figure out our budgets for different disciplines within the library. But since then, we've really realized that whether someone's patron data is after they return an item, if we really want to keep it, we should let them know. So we have moved to an opt-in, opt-out policy for circulation data since about 2021, 2022.
Mhm. If I could just add, briefly one thing, from the consumer web space, we all have grown accustomed to a personalized experience where we're being shown, I mean, whether sometimes it's too personalized, right? You've got that hat that follows you around the internet. But I think, a lot of the vendor tools and services can provide a personalized experience as Doreen mentioned. It's just how to balance it so that it is privacy preserving. And I think with more personalized and custom services, there's going to be just constantly changing expectations on the part of the students. Why doesn't this do what I wanted to do? I wanted to save my search. I want to have access to the things that I did, so it's going to be just an ongoing task. It's never going to be finished.
Yeah, I think it's just going to be changing constantly, as you say, because now that everybody wants one login, because I have all my passwords saved to Apple passwords, and my God, how many hundreds of passwords do I have? And wouldn't it be nice if we could just log in once? But then, of course, what kind of security do you have if everybody can get into everything by just hitting you one time? So all sorts of questions like this that between convenience and security are always a big deal with these systems. So, we've been talking about these various questions that were covered in the briefing, and I think these questions about permissions and the questions about who gets access to the data, very important. What other ongoing issues with privacy do you see as worth discussing?
Well, I'm thinking some of the things, I know Heather, you and I were talking about this. Camera surveillance is a big one, I think, even within libraries and generally on campus. And I think more recently that's become a bigger issue for us as well. And again, the ability to notify patrons that they are under surveillance, whether it's cameras, whether it is wireless access, particularly from phones when students come in our buildings and they just automatically connect. So we actually know where they are when they are in our buildings, and who has access to that data is a big topic on our campus. And obviously things like biometrics and other things like that, I think, are only going to be becoming bigger topics for us as we move forward.
Mhm. Yeah, and we revisited this kind of range of questions several times as the book was coming along, and you can't cover everything, in a book. So maybe there's another book in our future, who knows? And around the time that we were putting the book together, in its final format, there were a lot of privacy related topics that were bubbling up, which are, obviously still relevant. COVID happened towards the early part of submissions. So we needed to kind of do this from remote locations and have a new, maybe different flow. But certainly, COVID, in the wake of COVID, has people asking questions about privacy around personal data as it involves their health, as it involves maybe their vaccine status. We also saw, in the summer of 2020, large protests for racial equity and justice, which raises questions to, around privacy of what you're collecting in terms of, who's who amongst participants. Publishers are really looking at diversifying their author base, their peer review and editorial base, their peer reviewer base, but how can you appropriately collect and store demographic data? That's going to be something that's going on for quite some time. And with one of the large Supreme Court cases, Griswold versus Connecticut, which revolves around personal privacy, there's so much discussion of what our rights to privacy as individuals, what do they consist of? How does that play out, in our larger lives? There are many states that are looking at restricting conversations, teaching, resources around LGBTQ materials, and so perhaps privacy around those resources might take on a slightly different meaning. And then we're all sitting at this like precipice of AI and what AI will do to data, what can be included into a large AI data set, what, student papers, researcher papers being submitted to a conference, peer review reports, things that ordinarily had an expectation of some sort of privacy or at least siloing, now potentially, can get out there, in the wild together. The artists whose work has been used to train, AI data sets. So the issue of privacy and the issue of big data are inextricable, combined. And, so I think there's going to be a lot more work for IP creators, for copyright scholars, for our court system, to try to sort this out. So it's just, I don't want to leave people to think like it's a big mess that we're not going to sort it out. I'm confident there's smart people working on it, but it does, give you pause when you're sharing your data. Is that going to go into a big, training data set? And would you maybe select a different privacy setting to reduce the chances of that happening? I say completely stop it from happening, because I think we're in kind of the Wild West of that now. But at least we're talking about privacy, and so that bodes well, I think, for the future.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think the law of unintended consequences is something we just have to deal with when things are constantly changing. And as with open access, I don't think many people were thinking about the predatory publishers who popped up to take advantage of it. That wasn't what the people who were in charge of OA publishing had in mind. And so we just have to keep our eyes open and see what happens that we didn't expect, that we still need to respond to. So, very interesting topics. What final words do you have? What do you think we haven't discussed that's worth bringing up?
I mean, I'll just offer that privacy should really be woven into our daily actions, our daily activities. As individuals, we bear a responsibility, to do what we can in the face of this rapidly changing environment, and just, kind of try to keep it front of mind, try to make the best choices. Organizations that are creating and disseminating content, should be doing that, as well. There's a lot of good resources out there on that. And so I think if everyone just tries to be, intentional and keep privacy in mind, I'm optimistic that, we're moving, in the right direction, and we'll continue to do that.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that libraries in particular are extremely sensitive to the issue, and going forward, yeah, we'll try and involving patrons will hopefully make the best decisions we can to kind of balance everyone's needs. And actually, as we're talking about this, it's making me think that maybe we should, as an educational institution, develop a course in this for students. I think they really do find it interesting, and when we were doing interviews with them, I know Craig Smith, and that they found out that students just really don't understand really the depth of the information that they're giving up about themselves. And once they just kind of get an inkling of that, they really become much more engaged in it. So it's making me think there's a class or something around here in the future.
I'd like to
Yeah.
take that class.
Yeah, that's I think that's true, and I hope everybody who's interested in this topic will go to the ATG Media website and check out the briefing. Doreen and Heather, it was really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
My pleasure.